Okay. Hi. Oh, excellent. Hi, thank you. Grazie. That's my only Italian. Thank you guys very much for coming. Oh, now I'm quite low. My gosh, it's so wonderful to see a panel on gender and foreign correspondence like filled to capacity. You're delighting my heart. Thank you so much. So I'm Jina Moore. Yes, yay! Gender and foreign correspondence. I'm Jina Moore. I'm the East Africa Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Before that, I was the Global Women's Rights Reporter and a Senior Foreign Correspondent for BuzzFeed News. Before that, I was a freelancer for 7 years from living in Rwanda. That is not necessarily an expected career path in the United States, but that's what happened in reverse order. And I am here with an amazing panel of women reporters, one who she's still on the way, so hopefully we'll get a chance to hear from her before the end. And we're here today for a couple of notable reasons that I just want to share with you. I attended this conference last year and had a conversation with Diane Kemp, who had a panel this morning. She chaired a panel this morning on diversity in newsrooms. And we thought there were a couple of things we hadn't heard about at the conference last year that we wanted to hear about, so we just figured we'd pick the people we wanted to hear from and try to bring them to Perugia. Ergo, here we are. And that was possible thanks to really generous support from the International Women's Media Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C., and helped all of us get here, literally. So we're thrilled and excited to be here. From next to me, my left, to you, my right, I suppose, this is Alison Baskerville. She's a working photographer, past photojournalist, now documentarian photographer, and also the founder of an organization called ROAR, which is a safety training movement to make sure that journalists, however they identify, can get the kind of safety training that they need to feel comfortable working in the field, and with various and many different kinds of employers. And she'll talk a lot about all those different things. Next to her is Anna Holligan, who's a BBC reporter in The Hague, the Netherlands. I thought she said she was a BBC hate reporter. She said, no, Hague reporter. So the Dutch city, not the crazy thing taking over some of our politics. And she works as a freelancer and is going to talk about how gender and freelance and other things about gender identity that have nothing to do with our work impact our work. And then Jean Lee, who is now the director for the Wilson Center's Korea program, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, opened the Associated Press's bureau in Pyongyang in North Korea. And you were the Korea's bureau chief, is that right, for the AP, yeah, from Seoul? So why do just one bureau when you could do two in a completely closed country that nobody's ever worked in before? Because, you know. So we're going to hear from Jean as well. I just wanted to share a little bit before we get started. And two bits of housekeeping. We were supposed to have Deuce Namwezi, who is an incredible Congolese journalist, join us, but the Italians denied her a visa, so she is not here. But I'm going to talk a little bit about her work, which I know and find very impressive. And Cassandra Vinograd, who's a freelance conflict reporter, is driving in the manner of freelance conflict reporters as quickly as possible from the airport to try and join us, so hopefully that will work out. So Diane and I were talking last year about gender issues and the kinds of conversations we were having at the conference, and then over time, I found myself thinking a lot about this last year. And at the end of last year, in the American media, there's a little space called the Neiman Lab. And someone wrote an essay that was like, you know, there aren't any female foreign correspondents. We need more women doing foreign correspondent jobs. This gender bias must end. And I thought, okay, in general, I'm for ending gender bias. True. But I also realized that didn't really reflect my experience. When I read that, I was sitting in Nairobi as the East Africa Bureau Chief for the New York Times. My colleagues in Nairobi, the Bureau Chief for Reuters, the Deputy Bureau Chief for Reuters, the Bureau Chief for CNN, the head of Al Jazeera, and others were also women. And I thought, okay, maybe Nairobi is somehow special. That's entirely possible. But there seemed to be something kind of new and different going on that wasn't totally reflected in like the internet. And that kind of conversation. So then I thought more about it, and I thought, okay, around me here in Nairobi, there are also some really innovative journalism organizations bringing new kinds of news to people. There's something called Bright Magazine that's taking a new and critical and deep look at what we call development journalism and solutions-oriented journalism. There's a project in Kenya called Journalists for Justice, trying to connect what happens in The Hague to Kenyan readers and beyond that to African readers, whose leaders are usually the ones on trial trial in The Hague and to bridge the conversation that's happening in Europe about what happens in Africa and bringing it back to Africa so that it's told by Africans, but through this expert lens. The 4 books I know about Syria are written by women. And then I got really curious, and I was like, well, let me poke around a little bit more. The Washington Post's bureau chiefs in Jerusalem, Beirut, hold on, I wrote it all down here, Kabul and Islamabad are all women, and they are all serving in what someone and my organization recently referred to as high-octane jobs, which I thought was interesting. There's a lot of women who don't work in traditional institutions who do what I like to think of, now that I know the term, as high-octane work, and I think I'm sitting with some of them here today. And while I say that, I also want to acknowledge that there's a problem with the notion of high-octaneism. We still we can talk about gender in journalism, we can talk about female foreign correspondents. When we do that, we're talking about freelancers who take different sets of risks than those of us with staff jobs do. When we're talking about women who are navigating a staff structure, we're talking about a kind of different set of challenges to overcome. But we're all mostly working in a model that privileges a very masculine perspective on conflict reporting. And treats that as sort of the pinnacle of achievement. And especially when we're younger, I think we have the incentive structure is aligned to push us in that direction so that we can sort of, tick all the notches on the belt. If you're a freelancer, you try to earn a staff job by going into Syria. All these problems we know about because we've been talking about them more openly in the last 4 or 5 years than we ever have before. So I want to put out there that as I talk about that, I'm also talking about a structure that necessarily has embedded in it what I think is a particular kind of male perspective. I like to call it the male gaze, but that's with a Z-E, just to be clear. And then I think there's also a lot of women doing amazing work who are challenging the ways we just tell stories or who we tell stories about. There's a woman called Fatia Abubakar who works out of Borno State in Nigeria. You'll probably, if you don't know where Borno State is, you certainly know Boko Haram. And so Borno State is kind of the headquarters of Boko Haram. And Fatia has an Instagram feed called Bits of Borno that are absolutely beautiful photographs of everyday life in Borno, the kind of thing that we don't often see in the traditional media, and when we do, it's celebrated in ways that make it like just a little bit weird, right? Like it's actually much more normal than sometimes it seems. There's a woman called Omnia Shakwat in Khartoum who built an online magazine to look at digital and multimedia cultures and the kinds of things that weren't being represented in traditional media in Sudan and South Sudan. That's expanding now in East Africa. There's a woman I love to read anything she writes called Raffia Zakaria, who does mostly commentary work and writes books, but challenges repeatedly, consistently, and really usefully, I think, things about how the structures that we have embedded in the language we use for stories when we're talking about women in quote-unquote Muslim countries, right, or Muslim women in Western countries, and all the kinds of cliches and stereotypes and assumptions that get made in those conversations. So, if I were writing this out, I would say TLDR. There's a lot of cool women doing a lot of cool work that are changing the way we understand the world around us. And what I was really excited to do was be able to collect some of the women that I think are doing really cool stuff and have them tell you things. So that's what we're going to do. With that, I'll let Allie be the first cool person to tell you stuff.
I hate being first, but you were technically first. Can you hear me? I'm not. Do you want me to go closer? Sorry, I'll bring it a bit closer. There we go. I always do this. I always have something prepared to tell you about, and then as I'm listening to everyone around me, I start to change it in my head because I realise there's lots of things coming up. Especially, this is only my second conference in my life, so even this as a space is something I'm really learning a lot about. So I'm going to talk on 2 levels, really. I'm going to talk about a little bit about my own journey as a photojournalist and why I class myself as a former photojournalist now, and also about my own work with other people in doing hostile environment training or safety training in a slightly different way to perhaps more conventional practices and why I got to that point. And that's all I can really share. I mean, it's important for us to hear our own perspectives, but also when I'm talking to you about this stuff, I think what I've also learned is that when you learn to decenter from your own stories, when you really start to learn about other people's experiences, and that's a good place for me to start about why I became slightly more disillusioned with the role of photojournalism and how it reflected in how we represent people and how we other people and how we class them as different to us and how we often portray them as victims rather than survivors. So that was really the basis for a lot of the work that I do now. And my history is within the military, very institutionalized, and I was completely blind to my white skin. I was completely blind to my gender. I didn't feel like I was discriminated against at all, but in fact I was, because I had a level of ignorance that meant that I wasn't aware of that level of discrimination. And as a photojournalist, I followed the set route of photographing in places of conflict. I have an ex-military background. It was easy for editors to send me to front lines. I was more than able to work in those places. I was physically and emotionally resilient enough to do that. But I also had a level of safety training and also knowledge that gave me a certain sense of privilege that didn't really come into play until I started working around freelance photojournalists, but more importantly, local journalists and local fixers, and realized that they were taking extreme levels of risks to satisfy the need of the international media community. And that's when I took a step sideways and thought, okay, as a photojournalist and as a female photojournalist, I am representing a part of the industry that's still very much male-dominated, and I think that's valid, but equally, how much space am I making for female photographers of colour who are also working alongside me and have the same credibility to enter things like World Press Photo, but don't have the confidence because no one's opening the doors or helping open the doors, right? So I thought, well, what does that mean? As in, how can I do something about that without putting myself in white saviour role and trying to patronise women and men of colour who are working in the industry by saying, hey, I'll help you out, I'll give you this, I'll do that. Because that's kind of like, it's tired, that narrative, and people keep wheeling that out because there are really, really competent people working out there shooting their own stories. And I realised that a really good friend of mine 3 years ago said to me, she said, you know what, Alison, we're really tired of telling white people how to talk to us, what it's like to be black. Go to Google and start Googling, right? Start doing your own research. Like, if you want people of colour to tell you how to deal with us, pay us, right? We'll be your mentors, but give us a day rate. So I realised that there was a power balance, and then I started looking at white privilege and how I could kind of perhaps understand that better so that when I was talking to people of colour, I wasn't traumatising them with my ignorance. So it's a long story, but this is how I started to think more deeply about representation and how my role as a female photojournalist was very valid when I was thinking about gender representation in the sphere of white feminism, but when it comes to women of colour, it was still like very far away. So then I started reading Kimberly Crenshaw's essay about intersectionality, and I realised that there was another level, a deeper level that we had to go to really to make the industry more joined up and to create better bridges together. So we actually start working across those boundaries instead of reinforcing them by saying, I'm a woman and I work with diverse communities. No, you are diverse as a person and you're working in a community. Does that make sense? So we're not just saying, because people say terrible phrases like, I don't see colour. So that means you're erasing their heritage, their ancestry. And we all have it, right, as people. Whiteness doesn't mean that you don't have a heritage. You do. So I did a lot of reading. I wound down my photojournalism quite a lot because every time someone phoned me and asked me to go to Africa to cover a story, I would ask them, who's already there? Who have you got already on the ground who can actually produce this content for them? And do you have a plan for them? Do they have access to safety equipment? Do they have medical training? And it asked a lot of questions that I don't think people had been asking, other than media NGOs who were talking about this constantly, about supporting local people on the ground. So I kind of went away again. I do a lot of going away and coming back and speaking to people. And I've been really helpfully mentored by lots of different people over the last few years. I've listened to stories of physical risk, emotional risk, how you build better emotional resilience with physical resilience instead of this gung-ho, very masculine approach to war photography, kind of get yourself in there, get the pictures, doesn't matter if I die. That stuff is not okay for you to have a long, sustainable professional career. And also, what are you doing to the people that you're photographing? How are you representing them? Have you got their names? Do you know anything about them? How are you connecting to them? How are you empathizing with them? And then the other layer of that was speaking to other female colleagues who'd been on assignment or also living in that environment, who were experienced large amounts of harassment, sexual violence, and in the worst case had been raped whilst on assignment, not by strangers, but by people in their teams, people they worked alongside, and that sometimes it was people in positions of power, gatekeepers, editors, senior editors. I think you all kind of understand where I'm going with that. And I realized that there was another thing that we weren't really addressing at all. So I set up something called RAW. It's called RAW because I think regardless of how you put yourself out in the world, however you identify your gender orientation, whether you even associate to a gender, because I think we're really bored of this very cisgendered, heterosexual approach to talking about these things on panels, male, female, often very about straight people. If you're queer, if you're a queer person of colour, you don't get a voice in the room at all. So I think, for me, feeling safe in your own skin was about, well, what does that mean? Because everybody has a different view of how they feel safe, what their personal safety threshold is. So RAW is going to take a long time because on a practical level, I'm now teaching specifically around the area of sexual and gender-based violence, but to different people. So people come to the room and I facilitate sessions to ask them about what they actually need rather than telling them what they need. And in many cases, kind of white-splaining what they need, when in actual fact, they're the subject matter expert. They're the people that are coming to me and saying, we need this. So I have a set of skills that I've been privileged to get, right, through having a certain passport, through having a certain skin colour, through having a certain access to money. So now it's bringing that back out. And being a good ally is actually about stepping sideways or even stepping back and actually just listening. So RAW will take a long time because I'm building it on listening to people and using my experience to make some relevant training. And the last thing I'm going to say is that whilst I'm always keen to support other women on panels like this, and I think it's important, I think the makeup of panels has to change. I would like to see people from the queer community sat on these panels. I would like to see men sat on these panels talking about this. I'd like them to be fully engaged with the conversation and not sitting in a level of discomfort like it doesn't belong to them, because it absolutely does. All of this belongs to all of us. So when it comes to the safety training side of life, I don't want it to be a privileged thing for people to get because they've got like thousands of dollars spare, right? This should be built into your university programs. It should be built into your mindset when you're thinking about a career in journalism. And I just want to make that as accessible to people as possible. And I will charge big media companies lots of money so I can do it for a $5 for my friends back in Birmingham who get no access to this level of training whatsoever. And I get more satisfaction in doing that to like 18 to 30-year-old BAME women who are like, I don't even know how to leave my house safely because I'm not allowed to leave by my father. And these are things that we don't think about because we can just walk down the street and feel safe most of the time. I think I'm going to finish there, but that's kind of where I'm at the moment. I told you I was going to read about this book, and I'd completely changed my mind.
We might get there.
We might get there.
And to the like almost dozen women in the room, with that note, I say a special welcome, and we're happy to hear from you, but later. Go ahead.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks, Ali. I am not really used to doing this kind of thing. I'm used to talking about other people's stories and experiences. So to tell you a little bit about me, when I tell people that I'm a TV reporter and I work for the BBC, I'm a freelancer, and I work all over Europe breaking news stories. And when I mention that I'm now doing this with a baby, people talk about the BBC Dad. Has everyone seen the BBC Dad? Kids come running in, hilarious, viral. But when I saw that, I thought, okay, it's funny, but would it be the same if my baby appeared on screen? Would people be laughing, or would they be saying, ooh, you really should have dealt with that, like she should be looked after elsewhere, or you shouldn't be doing this, you can't have these two things simultaneously? So that's what I've been dealing with for the last year and a half, and kind of trying to manage these two things, which I love and care for deeply, my career and my daughter, and trying to work out how to maintain both of those to the level that I aspire to for myself, but also for younger women who are going to face these same kinds of issues when they come up. And what I discovered when I started doing this was that there weren't any rules. There was nothing written in the BBC rulebook or guidelines about how I could keep my daughter with me. I don't know how we can show pictures. Can we show any pictures? I've got some pictures just to make this kind of come to life. Yes. So that's what I do. That's my baby. Yeah. Her name is Jina. And that was when she was maybe about 6 weeks old. She looks like an alien there, but she's really cute, honestly. Anyway, so my idea was that I would kind of go back to work and juggle her. This is her a little bit more recently. We're about to go live, and she's really involved now, and she can pick up the mic and say hello to London when we're dialing in. Yeah, so I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to work, and she's going to be there in the buggy. And I was really naive, because until you have a baby, you don't really know what it entails, really honestly. So that's me recording a piece for Radio 4 and breastfeeding at the same time, because it was the only way that I could get her to be quiet. And all of these things about, yeah, really, I think I'd taken her off the breast there just for the photo. But anyway, there are ways of managing a baby and recording and live TV and live radio and all that kind of thing. So anyway, to go back, I gave birth after 30 hours of labor, and anyone who's done that knows how intense it can be. And if you haven't given birth already, you can imagine. And then an emergency C-section. So after 5 weeks, I felt like I could be reporting again. So let me just spin through this. So this was, okay. This was the first day back at work after 5 weeks. And she was in the buggy, and it was all fine. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do this one day of work. It was a guy at the ICC who was accused of tearing down the mausoleums in Timbuktu. So I thought, right, one day, and then I'll head back and look after the baby intensively for another few months. And then I just thought, actually, that was all right. So the next day, there was some more demand, and I think, I don't know, that was it.
That's not you.
That was a few days later. So anyway, so then I did the next day, and it was radio, and my husband was meant to look after the baby. We had a discussion. He decided he didn't want to do that, so I thought, okay, so I can say I'm not able to do the radio today, or I can strap her onto my front and I can jiggle around while I talk on air, and that's what I did. And that's kind of how it's been for the last year and a half. And this morning was at the International Court of Justice. This guy's a judge, obviously. And the Today programme, which is like a big programme in the UK, radio programme, they called and said, oh, we know you've just had a baby, but do you think there's any way you can manage this? And I said, yeah, fine. So 15 minutes later, we were breaking the news outside the ICJ, and she was happy. And I faced loads of questions about whether it's the right thing for her, whether it's the right thing for the BBC, how people feel about the BBC's reputation, when I rock up with a baby, how people respond to that. And I genuinely haven't had any negative responses to people in the field, either interviewees or anything else. Sometimes, like the guy who you saw right at the start, just ignored it. Like I had a baby attached to my front, just like he didn't see it. And really, I don't do these panels because I really feel uncomfortable talking about myself, but the fact that nobody was talking about it and I didn't know how to manage this makes me feel really passionately like young girls in the future shouldn't be having to deal with all of these issues themselves, or thinking like some women do, okay, I'm really, really ambitious and I really love my career. In order to continue it, I'm gonna have to kind of hold off having a baby or wait to have a baby, and then for so many women it becomes too late. So many of my friends who are flying in this industry keep on rising because they haven't had a baby. And I think that there is something missing there for women who don't want to have to depend on the goodwill of a partner or a man to keep on doing the job that they love. And that's partly why I think so many women are just disappearing from the industry, because it becomes like a battle, or like you feel like mummy guilt, that you can't give everything to one or the other. And so let me see what else we have here. So this was at the ICC when she was 5 weeks old, and that's the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, Fatih Bensouda. And just after this, before this photo was taken, she had cuddles with the baby. Afterwards, it was summer, so that's why she's not very well dressed, and afterwards she wanted the baby back for more cuddles, and I picked her up and realized that she'd filled her nappy and it was kind of leaking through the bottom, so I handed her over to the prosecutor and thought, no, actually we're gonna have to go now. And so I walked back to the car with her, and she was leaky all over me, and I thought, oh my God, this is not the dream. I'm not living the dream here. But actually, if you look at the photos, then, you know, I am. And I believe in mojoing as well. And I spoke to my boss, editor, yesterday, and he said, make sure that you don't look like just the BBC correspondent with a baby, because that will detract from your 10 years working for the BBC, breaking news and doing some of the biggest stories in Europe. And that is true. But it's also important to acknowledge that this is happening. And I really, really believe in mojoing, mobile journalism, and everything is possible with a smartphone, etc. So this is a day where we went to film at a school in Amsterdam, and you can see her looking at the camera like, yeah, what? This is what we do. Like, my mum's filming, she's going to edit, and she's got a baby. So the other thing, like when I talked to the health and safety and the hostile environment people inside the BBC about what I was doing, they obviously had a duty of care to me, and it's really important to talk about this because they had to make sure I understood that if I was going to take my baby to report from the edge of a road, then they wouldn't be responsible for the insurance. So much of this is common sense, but they have to say it. The BBC is not going to cover my daughter's insurance, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. And obviously when you're a parent, or you don't even have to be a parent to understand, if you have a child, then their safety comes before everything else anyway. So it kind of goes without saying. But there were also things I was advised not to talk too much about, because it might make other women feel the kind of pressure to do these things, so maybe don't share too much, and that I should be aware that I shouldn't make people have to think about my baby when it came to deployments, otherwise it could put people off deploying me on a story, because they would think, oh God, yeah, but she's got a baby, so maybe we need to. So all of those things came up, and they haven't really actually been resolved in a way that I think is a good way to be passed on to people who are going to come up against these same obstacles and barriers in the future. And it shouldn't be an obstacle, it shouldn't be a barrier, it should be just something that women can do. But also, when I talk to other women, they say, yeah, you know, you've got to make sure your partner is involved in that and is willing to step up. It shouldn't be about stepping up. It should be about when you're parents and you take an equal role. And that's onto a whole other issue of the institutions and how women and men have different rights to paternity leave and all that kind of stuff, which is for another panel, probably. So I'm just going to see if there's anything else I wanted to really tell you, because it was obviously different from me than it was for BBC staff reporters, because if you're staff, then you take maternity leave and then you go back to work and you have someone to look after your child. And so that was the other concern, that people wanted me to make sure that I wasn't having a life that others would want because I was freelance, so I had more flexibility in having her. She's obviously not with me there. So occasionally other people do look after her when I have to do long days of live TV and that kind of thing. But that's what I'm doing. Yes, it's really nice to be here and talk about it. But I fear that there are not many other women who are doing the same thing yet, just because of all of those issues. So thank you.
I have so many questions for you. And I think you raised some really good points because throughout my career, I felt that I've had to make a choice between my career and my mission, which I will talk to you about, and having a family. And there's absolutely no way that I could have done what I did in North Korea if I had a family. And I'm a little bit bitter about the fact that we have to make those decisions, or that we feel like we have to make those decisions. And so this is something that we need to talk about as women, because no one told me when I was a kid growing up in the United States with this dream of being a journalist, being a foreign correspondent, that it was such a macho world. I wasn't told that. You know, I was encouraged to dream big. I come from a family, my grandfather was a journalist in South Korea. He really instilled in me a love of stories and a love of sharing what I saw in the world. And he used to give me assignments and make me write down everything I saw in South Korea when I would go to visit. So I was very early given assignments as a foreign correspondent, but I wasn't given the tools to think about how I would do that as a woman. So I'm really glad that you're talking about these things. Now, I did prepare some photos as well, because I find that with North Korea, people want the visuals, because it's a place that we don't get too many. And you raised some very interesting points that I want to discuss as well about distance, because I think that's one of my concerns about coverage of North Korea, is that there's this gulf between us and the North Koreans, and one of my missions was try to bridge that gulf. Let me see if I can get the photos up and see if they work. And I was just thinking of having this, oh no, it's all in Italian. Let me see if I can figure this out. My Italian is fluent, apparently. I just thought I would try to scroll through this. There's no particular order, but I find that photos and video tend to provoke some interesting discussion. But let me just go back to, I told you a little bit about myself. I'm a second-generation Korean American. My parents were born in Korea when it was one country, and they ended up they're born and raised in Seoul, South Korea, so on the southern side, emigrated to the United States as graduate students, and that's where I was born and raised. But I knew throughout my career, I did get my professional start in South Korea, an English language newspaper, and I knew that I would always go back to South Korea at some point as a foreign correspondent. What I did not know was that it would be North Korea that I would be going to. People often ask me, when did I decide I was going to work in North Korea? And I said that was not something I ever thought I would do. I always thought I would be like the rest of us on the outside looking in, but it was on my first day of work as the AP Seoul bureau chief almost 10 years ago, it'll be 10 years in September, that my boss told me, what you're really here to do is open an office in North Korea. Now, for any of you who's worked in Asia, you know how hard it is to get a visa to get into North Korea. And so the prospect of having to open an office there was just mind-boggling. Just to give you a little bit of context, at the time, there was no American news presence inside North Korea. Still to this day, the AP is the only news agency that has, the only American news agency that has a presence there. The only media outlets that have a regular presence there are the Chinese and Russian outlets, so CCTV, Xinhua, the state news agency, People's Daily, and Itartos. So there is a small pool of foreign correspondents, Chinese and Russian, in Pyongyang. But what the president of the AP at the time wanted to do was to open bureaus in places that were former enemies or current enemies of the United States, and places where we didn't have much of a presence and that we wanted to get on the ground. Now, this is always a controversial and I think debatable issue, is whether it's worth getting on the ground in a place like North Korea where our access is limited. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll just, so I'm not going to go into the details of how it is I opened the office in North Korea, but I can tell you that I sacrificed a liver. There is a lot more, there was a lot of drinking involved. There is a lot more to negotiating. It's interesting because I went into journalism to tell stories about people whose voices I felt hadn't been heard, communities that were underrepresented. This started in California, where I was writing about Hmong farm workers, Mexican day laborers, and also about immigration issues, writing stories that I felt weren't being heard. But I think I've applied those same skills to the people of North Korea. But one thing that I was not prepared for as a journalist was to be a diplomat. And working in a place like North Korea required so much diplomacy. Well, I'm not sure that diplomats would say they had to sacrifice a liver as well. But there is so much more to trying to work in a place like North Korea where there's this gulf of a cultural divide, a language divide, a political divide. Remember that this is a country that still technically remains at war with the United States. So I was an American journalist going into enemy territory. But, and on the eve of the day that we were going to open the bureau, my colleague David turned to me and said, everything in your life has led you to this point. You've used everything that you have, your language abilities, your ethnicity, your people skills, your skills as a journalist to get to this point. And he was absolutely right. I had to pull everything that I had in my repertoire as an ethnic Korean, as an American, as a journalist, as somebody who learns how to, had learned how to speak to people and get them to tell their story. So everything that I had honed up until that point to try to get this bureau open. Now, one thing I should mention that I also want to take a second to thank you for bringing me here. It is so nice to get out of the bubble of North Korea news. It is such an intense time right now, as you probably know, but it's also good to get a little perspective. Okay, frankly, I'm thinking about the food as well because I'm starving right now. Stomach is grumbling. But also, it is so important for me to serve as an example. You know, when I got into this field, when I started this project of trying to open a bureau, I did look to see who my forebears were at the Associated Press. Who were the men and women who covered this country before me? Actually, there weren't any women, and they were all men. They were all white men. I remember I actually went through some of their old dispatches back in the day. I tell my students that we used to feed pieces of paper into something called a telex machine. I never actually did it myself. They still find a typewriter so ancient that they can't comprehend it. But I did actually find some of the original telex papers that they fed through the machine, and it was interesting the languages that they used. They called the North Koreans the Reds, so this was back in the 1950s, and they called the South Koreans peasants. And so I sometimes think they'd probably turn over in their graves if they knew that the child of one of these peasants was now running the AP office in Seoul. So that's how far things have come. And so I'm very proud of the fact that at the time when I became the bureau chief, I was the only woman bureau chief in Asia for AP. And with that comes a lot of sacrifices. But I'm very proud to be able to show what a woman can do in a place like North Korea. And I'll show you a little bit about what that means. So this is, I don't know, do you want me to walk through some of these photos and tell you what it is we're seeing here? So one of the things, talk about, well, you see that I'm ethnic Korean. One of the tools that I found incredibly helpful was to learn their dialect. So my Korean, I will admit, is not very good. I am a second generation. I grew up in, it is my first language, but as soon as I could, I stopped speaking it. But it worked to my advantage because when I started negotiating with the North Koreans, they looked at me, they heard me speaking Korean and said, well, you're definitely not a spy for South Korea because your Korean just isn't good enough. And so they knew very clearly that I was, and because this is always the risk, is that you're going to be taken as a spy. I do think that I was always treated with the scrutiny that somebody in espionage would be treated. And so that meant 100% surveillance, 100% monitoring. And this certainly affects the kind of work that we do. But they did know that I was an American, and they could understand that I was an ethnic Korean from overseas. And they actually have experience with these communities. They have ethnic Koreans who live in China and Japan that they rely on quite a bit to serve as a bridge. So they were able to look at me and see me as an ethnic Korean from America, somebody who doesn't fit the stereotype of an American, because their propaganda is so extreme. It starts from the time they're very little and shows Americans as their enemy. But I didn't look like that enemy. So for them, that gulf wasn't there. They looked at me and saw me as a Korean. Now, when you are going through North Korea, if you don't look like them, obviously, you get they learn to put a mask on. And so it's very hard, if you're not able to bridge that gulf, to really get a sense for what they're thinking and who they are. Because I look like them to a certain degree, and by the end of my tenure there, I was able to pass for North Korean. So I did have certain tricks, and we know that this was the case because when I carried my camera, I have it in my bag, but it's a professional Canon camera. About 30 times a day, I would have North Koreans coming up to me asking how much I charge for a photo. Because most North Koreans can't afford their own camera. So photographers go around with tiny little portable printers, and they'll charge about 3,000 North Korean won to take their portrait. And so I use this as an opportunity to tell my staff, well, this is what we're going to do. They all think I'm a North Korean photographer. We're going to charge 2,800, undercut the rest, teach them about capitalism. But it was, it was beneficial in the sense that I was able to, by learning their dialect, and their dialect is a little bit like, I compare it to learning how to speak with a British accent. It's a different intonation, it's a different dialect, it's a different vocabulary. They spell their letters a little bit differently. So you're speaking the same language, but in a slightly different way. By learning how to speak their dialect, I was able to bridge that gulf and to chat with them in a way that I think most foreign correspondents aren't able to. So this is a picture I took. These are the kind of moments that I absolutely cherish. Just a construction worker taking a few minutes rest at a high-profile construction project. This is the construction of a hydroelectric power station, but just one of those candid moments that we don't often get to see. Just to show you a little, these are two of my colleagues from AP, just a little to show you what it's like we were constantly looking at things through a window, but it did give, riding the train up to, we were going to a rocket launch pad, did give us a chance to see what the countryside is like. Because one thing I will tell you is that if you do get access as a foreign correspondent, often it's at the invitation of the government on a very short, orchestrated propaganda tour. And so by opening an office in North Korea, I was able to spend weeks on end there and get to see the country in between the theater. And that was absolutely crucial to being able to capture this place away from the drama and the theater that they wanted us to project. So you get to see things like this, getting outside of the capital city and seeing what the countryside looks like, the devastation and the environmental degradation, the reality of what daily life is like for North Koreans. If you look on my Instagram feed, you'll see, if you scroll back far enough, you'll see images where I start the morning in North Korea in a scene like this and end the day in South Korea to the same mountains, but absolutely verdant, covered with trees, and not as destroyed as they are in North Korea. So you see a little bit of the contrast between North and South because I did go between the two Koreas. The opportunity to get inside homes, which is something that we don't get to see very often, and to go to small villages that have been destroyed by flooding. So often I was taken to these villages. I asked to go to these villages and was told I was the first American to visit these places. So I was very aware that I played not only a role as a journalist, but as a representative of my country. It was the first time people were meeting Americans. But you can see this is not the kind of image that you usually see from North Korea or that you see from our foreign media coverage. I don't think that any other foreign correspondents have been able to go to a village like this and see a village that is cut off from electricity, where they have no clean water, they have no access to food. Inside a home. It's just fascinating if you take a look at it. Of course, in every home, you'll have the portraits of the leaders, in this case, portrayed on calendars. These calendars are from, I think, 2002, so they're meant as decoration and homage to the late leaders of North Korea. But you can see the kind of attention to detail, even though this is in the countryside on a farm. The doilies on to protect and cover their appliances. This family had you can see the DVD player. They had a generator, because in the countryside, of course, once the sun sets, that's when you lose your access to light and electricity. But also, if you notice, she's wearing a T-shirt that shows 101 Dalmatians. So a little bit of showing this is something that's imported from China, but also showing their exposure to American Disney cartoons. Again, portraits of the late leaders on the wall of the bedroom. And just a little bit of a candid moment with these puppies. I did ask them, because they do eat dog in North Korea, I did ask if they were pets, and they said they are pets, but we are going to eat them. Now, I don't mean, I am a dog lover, and I don't mean this to be any kind of animal rights issue, but it's a reality for North Koreans that it's one of the only sources of protein that they have. One of my friends asked me, my South Korean friends asked me to take some video inside a barber shop, just everyday scenes, right? I think this one is hilarious because it almost looks like Kim Jong-un sitting in that seat, right? Because that haircut is very popular. Contrary to popular notion, it is not required to get your hair cut like Kim Jong-un, but it is very popular. And this one I like because the barber is actually deaf. One of the things I had asked was to be able to see how the disabled were treated in North Korea. So I was able to see some disabled who were given skills and brought out of the shadows and into daily life. So that's another aspect of this that was very nice to be able to see. Just a street scene, I think, that captures a little bit of the fashion that we're starting to see in North Korea, and also cell phones. So in the time that I've been there, which has been 10 years, I think the use of cell phones has been the most powerful development in North Korea, because it has given them an opportunity to communicate with one another. Now, the cell phone network is divided. North Koreans can call one another, but they could not call me. And I could call my sister in Brooklyn, but I could not call my North Korean staff. So it's a divided network, yet one of the many, many tools designed to keep the North Koreans separate from foreigners, and one of the challenges that we face in trying to reach the North Korean people. But just like us, they walk down the street texting now, so they're starting to develop a lot of that cell phone addiction that we're already accustomed to. Again, another candid shot that I wanted to show you how we bridge the gulf between us and the North Koreans. These are just two soldiers that I happened to come across while walking through downtown, and I stopped to talk to them. One of my staff's favorite game was to see how far I could go in chatting with the North Koreans before they had to step in and say, you know, she's an American, don't you? Because it's actually illegal for them to interact with Americans or foreigners without permission. And I did start to chat with these guys, and I asked them what they were doing, and they said, we built this neighborhood. We built these buildings, and we're enjoying the fruits of our labor. So we had a nice little chat, but it was important for me to see the sense of pride that they felt, because previous to that, I had been to this military construction site and had only noticed that they were moving everything by hand, brick by brick. And so I only saw the hardship, and I hadn't seen the sense of pride that they had in building these buildings. So it helped me understand a little bit of the North Korean perspective behind some of these big propaganda projects. This is a picture I took last year on May Day. One of the few things that North Koreans can do, despite the hardship that they face, is have a picnic. So the most common thing that they'll do on a holiday or on a day off is have a picnic. And you can see the sense, this is a very different vision of the North Koreans, right? And what I love here is keep an eye on that grandpa. Singing and dancing, also free. This is also something that they like to do on their days off, doesn't cost money. He actually eventually did get down on the ground and start breakdancing, which just a humanizing moment, I hope, that shows that they are real people. People are often surprised when they see images like that. Like they're laughing and they're smiling, despite the poverty and the hardship. Yeah, I mean, their lives are incredibly difficult. I cannot tell you how difficult it is to live in North Korea. Oh, here he is. I think he's, I call that breakdancing. I'm not sure what he would call it.
I call it a meme waiting to happen.
And one more. Oh, I don't know if this is the right video, but. Okay. Does anyone recognize this music? So what I love about this is they clearly, okay, A, that the Macarena has even gotten into North Korea. And B, they know there's a dance that goes with it, but they don't quite know how to do it. So I told one of my friends to get up there and show them how it's done, because I frankly don't know how to do it either. But they can't Google it. They don't have access to the outside internet. They don't have access to our internet, so they can't Google it. So just a couple images to show you what...
Wow, that's
yeah.
fantastic.
So to talk a little bit about... And so for me, it's very important to try to humanize them. We do all the very critical reporting, absolutely essential as well. I did a lot of reporting about the nuclear program. I do write a lot of commentary right now to try to put what we're seeing, all these developments on North Korea, into perspective, provide context, provide the background and the history. But one thing that we are missing without access on the ground is understanding who they are as people. And despite the fact that I did open that bureau in North Korea, I think we're still challenged in trying to get access and trying to get the kind of access that would help us understand who they are, what they want, how to deal with them. And until we crack that, the diplomats who are representing both the United States and the South Koreans, the Chinese, and other countries in the region are going to have a hard time negotiating with them. To the question of what of the role of gender in working in a place like North Korea. Now, as a woman, and particularly as an Asian woman, I have certainly had my share of Me Too moments, some pretty gruesome ones that I've never shared publicly, and I do suffer from some guilt for not having confronted them early on in my career. And I do talk about this privately with some of my colleagues because I have some regret that I didn't confront them early on and perhaps allowed women who followed in my footsteps to undergo the same thing. Some pretty egregious examples of sexual intimidation that was carried out by both my colleagues and my supervisors when I was much younger. But I did recognize back then that to become a journalist meant to be tough, and so my way of coping with that was to be tough and try to look past that. It is something that I have a bit of guilt about now and hope to share and discuss a bit because I do think that's the reality of what it means to be a woman in this field. Now, one thing I found as an Asian woman is that I tend to look, I feel old, but I tend to look younger than my age, and that has affected the way people treat me. And one thing I've learned in the process is that it doesn't help me to be macho. I am not a man. I have to face the fact that I am a woman, and what I've done in my career is try to use that to my advantage. One thing I learned early on is that perhaps because I'm a woman, people are much more comfortable speaking to me than they might be to a man. And that's just a tool that I've learned to use to my advantage. And I try to tell young women as well that there's no way around the fact that we're women. We have to find a way to use that to our advantage and to not to try to compete with men, but to come to the table with our own attributes, our own skills, and embrace and accept the fact that we are different. I cannot compete with men with the same set of skills. I've got a different set of skills, and I'm going to bring those to the table. And that's absolutely why it's important to have diversity, whether it's diversity of gender, sexual orientation, or race, because we do all have different skills that we bring to the table. And we can tell stories from a different angle based on our perspective, our difference of our perspective, and different access that we have because of that perspective. I am absolutely convinced that I was able to open that bureau in North Korea because I am who I am. Part of it is because the North Koreans looked across the table and saw someone that they thought that they could work with. And so it was very smart on the part of the AP president to put me in that position. He knew that I would be able to play a certain role, and it turns out a groundbreaking role. So this is something that I'm absolutely proud of. I wanted to get to the issue of, you were talking about distance or the gulf in your photography or in photography in general. And that is something that I think I see in the photography by women photojournalists in North Korea versus male photojournalists. It's an observation I've noticed, is that some of the women shooting in North Korea are able to get closer to their subjects in a way than the men haven't been. And so that's something to pay attention to as well, that there is a difference in what we're getting on the ground based on our gender as well. I think I'm going to leave it there because I think I've gone well beyond. I'm stalling a little bit because I keep hoping that Cassie will turn up and run in. But I'm sure you have a lot of questions for all the panelists, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. As we've been hoping, Cassie might walk in that door, which is not going to happen, but you'll hopefully have a chance to meet her at some other point during the conference. I just wanted to give a nod to her work and also tell you very briefly about the work of Jina Moore, who wasn't able to join us. Cassie's done a lot of incredible work from conflict zones across Africa. She was also with the AP in Kabul for years. She's been all over the place, and she is as tough a journalist as they come. But if you have a whole bunch of gender bias in your head, pretty easy to underestimate because she's also beautiful, petite, and sweet. So look out, warlords. She did a piece about a female rebel group or a brigade of a female brigade in a rebel group in the Central African Republic. And I just want to read the lead of it to you because for me it kind of encapsulates one of the things that's very different about having women have the idea to do this coverage. A man could have done this story, absolutely. As a man, you could go in and talk to female rebels in the Central African Republic. That would work, but it wouldn't have sounded like this. Here's the opening. Melvia wants to make something very clear. She joined the rebels to kill, not to boil manioc or perform other chores that are usually dumped on women. She wanted to fight back against the men who attacked her village in the Central African Republic, torched her home, killed her grandmother. I didn't join the group to cook, she says. I wanted to do the hard work. Oh, hi. There she is. Well, if I'd known reading your words was all it would take to summon you, I'd have done it an hour ago. And I thought that was just an incredible way of getting at gender and these issues. Yes, hello.
3 minutes early.
Yeah, don't hug me. I'm just.
I'm going to give you a hug.
Welcome. As you sit, I'm going to tell you guys also briefly about Jina Moore. Deuce is a Congolese radio producer, now the director of a station called Mama Radio. And the origin story and trajectory of Mama Radio, I think, is in a lot of ways similar to like the trajectory of women in foreign correspondence and like women's issues, quote unquote, in international news. So Deuce was mentored by another female radio journalist called Shushu Namagabe, and Shushu was the only female reporter and producer at a station in South Kivu, in Bukavu, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You may know Bukavu as named by a UN senior official, the rape capital of the world. Not a name that a Congolese person would have come up with, but we'll move on. And when that happened, Shushu was reporting and said, okay, so this is all that anyone's talking about in the international press. It's all that the women around me are talking about, but it's not on the radio. Why not? And there was one female editor at the station who said, all right, if you can find a way to do it, then do those stories, bring them on the air. So they put stories about women being raped on the air in Congolese radio, and as you might imagine, the Congolese freaked out. Men said, this is a shame for women. Why would you want to publicize this? How dare you speak about this publicly? It forced a communal conversation that hadn't been had. She turned that into a weekly radio program, bringing women's voices on the air about different issues. And now Deuce, who's kind of inherited the organization now that Shushu has moved on, turned that weekly radio program into a daily news station. So they run 16 hours of programming a day on all kinds of different topics, but there is one cardinal rule that is still kind of hard for some of her new reporters to learn. No story goes on the air unless there's a female voice in the story. Doesn't matter what it's about. So if you're talking about inflation in the marketplace, you better be talking to a woman, and not just because she's the sad person who can't sell her beans. And I think, well, if you can do that in Eastern Congo with no resources and a huge patriarchal power structure against you, the rest of us sure as hell can be doing a lot better. So go to Congo and meet Deuce. That's my recommendation. I think officially we have like maybe 15 minutes for questions. Unofficially, no one's in this room until 2. So does anyone want to, I would love to turn it over to you guys and see if you have questions. And then maybe we can also integrate Cassie into the Q&A part of the thing. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. Of course. Go for it, sir.
You're crazy. Did you miss your flight?
That's some heroic driving, woman. Well done.
Hi, I'm from Russia. I'm an independent journalist, and I think it's a great topic to discuss. And my question is a little bit out of the area of the topic, but it's still concerning the role of women. Despite the fact that I am a man, I still stand up for the idea that women has a great role in journalism, international journalism, and sometimes women dare to do things that men maybe would never ever dare to do. I mean, visiting hotspots, telling people the truth by their reportages, etc. And I know that sometimes, or maybe a lot of times, women, brave women are being cruelly persecuted for the things they do in many countries. And for example, in Russia, we know that, if you know Politkovskaya, journalist Politkovskaya, she told the truth, and a lot of family names, like Svetlana Ladurus is now persecuted cruelly for the documentary projects. And I have just one question: how can we, the society, or maybe other ways, can we protect such hero women in this world for the things they dare to do?
Thank you. Maybe we can take a couple of questions at once? Yeah.
Thank you. Hello? My name is Magda Abou-Fadel. I'm a former correspondent and editor with AFP and UPI. And then I moved to academia, and now I train journalists, and I've helped produce a semester-long university course on safety for journalists for the Arab world, Middle East, and North Africa. And I'd like to ask all of you, if any of you have suffered from PTSD, and how different that is from your male colleagues, and any of the pressures that you've suffered from, maybe psychologically and physically, and how you've overcome that in terms of what you can give to other journalists, young up-and-coming journalists, and how they can deal with that problem.
Maybe one more. We'll take in groups of 3s. Sure.
Thank you. My name is Vincenzo Foucault. I'm from Tanzania, and I work for Tanzania Media Foundation. I'm a media development expert, and one of the programs that I do is to design programs for journalists so that they can report stories that will trigger accountability in Tanzania. But one of the challenges that I face is to getting women into reporting, you know, sensitive stories, or being investigative journalists, or doing stories that would bring, you know, change. They like covering, I must say, simple stories. But even getting them to participate in the program sometimes it's not easy. But listening to, you know, I call it Powerhouse, you know, covering the stories, and I'm a mother myself, so listening to Anna, for instance, or in North Korea, it's not easy. I would really like to know how, what are the possible opportunities that maybe we can discuss even later on how I can support these women to cover, stories, because I know how powerful women's stories are. But if they're not nurtured, if they're not mentored, it's not easy to get these women to talk these stories. So I would really like to know from you whether there are opportunities for mentorship, or if we can discuss about partnerships on how I can support these women in Tanzania. Thank you.
All right, so let's take these three at once. I'm gonna maybe re-encapsulate as well. Please bear with me to sort of open some of these up to the widest possible conversation. Maybe we can interpret the first question as a question about being safe on the job. I'm going to confess I'm having a little tiny bit of a feminist, I don't need your protection moment going on. Yeah. So let's open that up as a safety question, if that's all right. And then we can talk about PTSD and psychological safety in a way. Actually, there's a good theme there. And then we can talk about mentorship connections and bringing women into workspaces where they're not going to get there on their own without some help. And what could that look like strategically? You want to kick us off?
Yeah. I'm with Jina a little bit on the idea of protection of these hero women, also the word hero and heroic. And actually it gives me a nice segue into this book by Svetlana Alexievich, The Unwomanly Face of War, which is about the testimonies of Russian female soldiers in the Second World War as tank commanders, snipers, infantry people. They were doing all of it. This book was censored in 1984, heavily censored, and was re-released in, last year, 2017, with all the full testimonies. And I had a little bit in here to read out because I thought it was quite enlightening. So I think it's not really about how do we protect these women. I wrote some points down immediately, like question power, first of all, like who has the power of making these decisions? Who is it that's in those positions? And actually, can they, rather than feel like sidelining women's voices around talking or speaking out or calling out culture, we have to change the narrative around when women speak up, because there's really negative words associated to women who speak up. Bossy, right? Outspoken. Why is it outspoken? To say what you think. And also the last thing I'm going to put is patriarchy. Patriarchy is about looking in the mirror, questioning how the system as patriarchy has given you a certain sense of privilege that perhaps a woman doesn't have, and how we change that a little bit. People talk about toxic masculinity, and I think actually a lot of the work has to be done by men as well, not just like questioning, how can I protect a woman? Well, okay, but who am I as a man in this space? Like, what can I actually do with other men to dismantle these power structures so that women don't need any protection from anything, right? That's a bigger picture aspiration. Rather ideological, but, you know. And then, you know, as a woman, learn a little bit of self-defense, learn where to punch people, just on a practical. Sorry, I had to do that.
May I?
It occurs to me as you say that, actually, Ali, that so I work in East Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a lot of conversation in the development space about a principle called do no harm, and there's supposed to be a lot of self-reflection by development workers about well-intentioned intervention. It's an idea of checking your intentions against the actual work that you're doing in the world, and hopefully, if you're open enough and reflective enough, making sure that you protect yourself against actually creating a problematic or harmful or negative scenario for the people you're trying to help, but missing that completely, because you're so preoccupied by how nice it was of you to think of it in the first place, right? So checking your intentions against your consequences, and I think that maybe we, you know, if one can make a call to all the men on the planet, it might be ask yourself if in whatever space you're in, especially professionally, are you doing no harm? Right, at least as a first principle, and then, you know, secondarily, how can I be a good ally? And I think there are a lot of women who are willing to talk to men about how to be good allies, but keep in mind that that is a form of unpaid labor as well.
And pay us a day rate.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we could talk also about psychological safety and PTSD in
Can I just add one?
Yeah.
Sorry, just got here and I'm already.
Yes.
In terms of your question, I think, to cut a bit of slack, and I hear what you guys are saying too, the cases you mentioned are about press freedom and attacks on the press. So it's not about protecting hero women or anything like that, but it is about addressing issues around press freedom and danger for journalists. So yes, some of those names, the cases you cited, are really widely known because of the work they were doing, the country they were doing it in. But there are a lot of other people who are detained, who are targeted. There's a big story out this week about a female colleague of ours. So it's about press freedom, plain and simple. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that space.
But may I add something? How maybe do we have any concrete ways to protect such journalists who are in trouble now? Maybe organizations, some who can protect them, their rights. Because I know that there are lots of countries that are not welcoming such talks inside the country. I mean,
I think probably. I mean, for sure, I can think of a few. You can probably think of a few. I'm going to invite us to have that conversation offline, if that's all right. But please do follow up. Yeah. So we have questions on the table about mentoring and about PTSD as a shorthand for trauma. Sorry, Bruce.
I can talk a little bit about PTSD. So I worked in a country where there wasn't a lot of physical danger, perhaps, but the psychological pressure of being monitored under surveillance, that wasn't something I was expecting. It is amazing what it does to your psychological state. It's almost, I kind of compare it to, it almost feels like you have the flu the whole time you're there. You know how when you have the flu, you're just like, you're impatient, you're not yourself? That's what it feels like to work in North Korea all the time. And I think that I wasn't prepared for that. It took me 2 years to recover it took me 2 years before I could sit through a meal without feeling like I had to get up and run out the door because I felt claustrophobic. And so I think that that's something that needs to be recognized when you work in repressive regimes, is that there is that psychological component. And so that's something that I try to draw attention to.
I come from a military background, as some of you know, and PTSD is a term that became really prevalent after the war in Iraq. It's post-traumatic stress disorder, which actually reinforces what I'm about to say. You need to understand what PTSD is. And also it's a very well-used term now, but there are actually symptoms associated to it. And I think often in many cases people will have an anxiety disorder or depression or a combination of those that may not actually be PTSD. So I think the first port of call is actually to understand what that term means, because actually what we don't want to do is become less resilient to what we're doing because we've been labelled with something that actually we haven't had diagnosed. So I think getting professional psychological support regularly, and not because you're having a breakdown, as in part of your work process. So building emotional resilience isn't about waiting until, excuse my language, the shit hits the fan, you feel like everything's falling apart and then you get a diagnosis. I actually think counselling in this line of work is something that you should regularly do and check in with people when you've interviewed somebody who's had experiences of trauma as well, because you're the kind of pot that they're going through to talk about their stories, and you should be as clean as you can be, like when you're doing your cooking, which I do very badly. So I think it should be built into the workflow. I think asking people if they've had any experiences with PTSD could be quite triggering, and perhaps something that we wouldn't want to share openly as well. I think there's always something we need to be mindful of as well, because it's something that we do in journalism, right? We get people to talk about the worst thing that ever happened to them. So we need counselling support alongside for that too, right?
Yeah, but as a woman, compared to your male colleagues who may have or suffered from PTSD, there's a former colleague of mine who's a photojournalist, covered conflicts for 30 years.
Yeah.
And he's been going through a treatment and all sorts of therapy. He's given up on going to war zones because it completely messed him up.
I think the only way, for me, and I'm talking from my perspective here, right? I'm not speaking for everybody. My experience of getting support for symptoms likely to be PTSD, which is something I did a few years ago after a trip, was that I didn't feel I could access it because the representation of PTSD was very much male-orientated. And that's still the case, especially in the military veteran community. And often this terrible label of, well, you're a woman, you're emotional. You know, it's like that gets put your way quite a lot. So a call to all women who experience these psychological symptoms is to be open about it, but then don't become the poster girl for PTSD, right? It's a balance, really, because you don't want to keep traumatizing yourself. Yeah.
And one thing, just exactly what you said, because PTSD is so specific. I think that one thing that we started to see a lot of when I was still in a newsroom, because I only went freelance like a year and a half ago, with the internet, with certain terrorist groups and imagery that's going around, there are a lot more people who are exposed to traumatic imagery, and they won't present 9 times out of 10 typical PTSD symptoms. So we had to become aware and really talk to our teams about, you know, you need to be aware of how your body is reacting, and if you need the people around you to say if something seems a little off. Because you might not have PTSD, but you've definitely gone through something, even if it's just looking through, and not even, I don't want to diminish the horrors of looking at ISIS imagery. But so we had to have a lot of conversations with our staff about recognizing, self-recognizing what was going on. And in terms of male colleagues and being different, I think the only thing that I think could kind of speak to that is, like, I know how my body reacts in intense situations. So one thing I've had to do is, when shit has hit the fan, I felt the need to kind of explain to my male colleagues what was going to happen. Because my blood pressure drops, I get weirdly calm, my voice gets really calm, and it's very zen. And I know that normally about 30 to 40 minutes afterwards, I'll start to shake and cry. And so I've had to, tell male colleagues, okay, I'm fine, we're alive, it's okay. Just gonna tell you, I will probably start crying in a little bit. It's just natural, it's what happens to me. And if I need anything further down the line, those are resources that I will seek out.
And one last tiny bit. I met a woman called Patrice Cullors-Khan recently, who's the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. And she said, as a society, we've become obsessed with self-care. She said, but if you're doing difficult work, it's about collective care and how we actually are better allies together. So looking at peer groups and support, similar to what Cass is saying, those little closed Facebook groups, you can get a lot of stuff solved just reaching out to each other. It's a very individualistic community sometimes in journalism, but when you're out together on reporting on something, that'll be where you make your best mates, right? So that kind of collective care is really important in that sphere as well.
We're being cut off by the men in the room.
Oh, ironic.
We can continue this conversation outside. We'll find each other and have drinks. I'm so sorry we didn't get to mentorship and networks, but don't go anywhere. I want to talk to you.
Yeah, the woman from Tanzania.
Thank you guys
don't leave
so much
the room,
for,
please.
for coming.
We want to speak to you.
Sorry I was late.